Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the last weekend asked President Isaac Herzog to pardon him for bribery and fraud charges to end his 5-year corruption trial. Netanyahu is facing 3 separate corruption cases filed in 2019, known as Case 1000, Case 2000 and Case 4000, which involve allegations of bribery, fraud and a breach of trust. Now, this did not happen in a supposed vacuum. A few weeks ago, when US President Donald Trump went to Tel Aviv, he had asked President Isaac Herzog, "Mr. President, quote unquote, why don't you pardon this man?" And I guess Netanyahu took the initiative to say, well, if the most powerful man in the world can ask you, who am I not to ask you? Joining me now to take this conversation forward, I'd like to welcome independent researcher and expert on Israeli affairs, and he has done extensive work on its occupation throughout the Palestinian territory, Dr. Shir Hever. Shir, always good having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Shir, I'd like to think that this just didn't happen sporadically. This was, of course, the seeds being planted by Donald Trump in asking, some may even say demanding, from Isaac Herzog that go ahead and pardon Netanyahu because these fraud and corruption charges are but a mere minuscule act by this guy.
No, I don't think so. I think the idea came from Netanyahu, and Netanyahu probably coordinated with Trump and told him that it would be nice if he mentions the idea of a pardon when he comes to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And I think Trump was happy to indulge Netanyahu because an attack because he sees in Netanyahu a very similar case to himself, a far-right racist leader who scoffs at the rule of law and promotes right-wing populism.
Shir, in the history of Israeli-United States relations, which is probably as strong as you can get, I don't remember an actual Israeli prime minister, and probably you could correct me, that has made trips to Washington to go ahead and strengthen its ties and, of course, get the supposed backing for its genocide in Gaza, its military operations that are happening in Lebanon, and as early as this week, we saw what happened in Syria. Is this relationship between Trump and Netanyahu so close that this potential pardon is more realistic than we see it to be?
Well, actually, every Israeli prime minister made frequent trips to Washington to strengthen U.S.-Israeli relationships. And I think that Israel's whole strategy in order to continue its colonial project in the Middle East and the occupation and the apartheid, and now also the genocide, hinges on its ability to present itself and as a proxy of the U.S. empire in the region. And I think that this, in this way, what we see now in the United States is that a lot of U.S. officials, politicians, actually mostly from the far right, are saying that Israel has turned from an asset to the U.S. into a liability, because the idea that Israel is a proxy of power of the United States, as it has been in the past, is now forcing the U.S. to spend more resources and more of its political and legal capital in the world in order to support Israel rather than receive support from Israel. So I think that this relationship is certainly coming to a very strong straining point. I do think that the issue of the pardon that Netanyahu is trying to get in Israel, I'm not even sure that he's really trying to get it, but it's a ploy inside the Israeli public, which in the Israeli political scene, which I think we should pay closer attention to and understand what Netanyahu is really trying to achieve with it, rather than just just as one more act of support from the United States and complicity of the United States with Israel's crimes, because of course the United States could absolutely continue to be complicit with Israel's atrocities and could have theoretically continued to give weapons to Israel and so on, even if it's another prime minister in power.
Shir, Netanyahu says that he's done nothing wrong, and he claims that the corruption trial is a quote-unquote deep state conspiracy. It's politically orchestrated by a witch hunt through his rivals and the media. Now, when I look at the coalition that is in Israel right now, it's heavily far-right orchestrated, especially when you look at individuals like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. I guess the question is he fearing a potential collapse of that coalition, which really has pushed it even further in terms of its orchestration of the genocide that we see in Gaza, and of course these settler attacks, and we're seeing now by the Israeli army continuous attacks happening in the occupied West Bank?
Netanyahu's statement that he did nothing wrong is convinces no one, including not his strongest supporters. And Netanyahu, on the one hand, has said that he welcomes the trial against him, that this is finally his opportunity to prove his innocence in court. So he really is happy that charges have been pressed against him. And now, at the same time, he's saying, well, it's actually not in the interest of the state that this trial will be played out, and it's better to stop the trial now. So he's willing to forsake his ability to prove his innocence. But of course, everyone in Israel knows that Netanyahu is a pathological liar. And in fact, in his own trial, he said, as part of his testimony to the judges, half jokingly, I don't always make a point of telling the truth, which I think is really his strategy. His strategy is not to protect his coalition with those far-right partners like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. His strategy is to protect himself with whatever coalition is necessary in order to keep himself in power. So this is the deal that he's offering the Israeli public. He's saying, I am going to lie, and I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to tell you that everything is fine, and I'm going to tell the world that Israel is not committing genocide and deny the facts that everyone are aware of the atrocities that are still committed in Gaza, even now as we speak, despite the so-called ceasefire. So he's saying all of this, and then the Israelis have their role to play in this deal, which is by believing him and by keeping him in power, they have an alibi. Then they can say, oh, we didn't know. We thought that everything is fine and there is no genocide. And Israelis realize that if they lose this alibi, they will be emotionally, psychologically culpable to answer for those crimes. They will find themselves in the position that Germans have found themselves in the position after the Second World War, after the Holocaust. And I think this is exactly what the Israelis are so afraid of. So if you look at it from this point of view, it actually serves Netanyahu's interest that he's caught in the lies. He intentionally lies in order to create this alibi where the Israelis need him. They cannot let him go. And so if you read actually what he told President Herzog in his request for pardon, he didn't say, I'm going to follow the process of a pardon, which according to Israeli law means that he has to first of all admit to wrongdoings. He has to first of all admit that he has committed a crime, and only then the president can pardon him. No, what he said is if it is now a time of great crisis in the Israeli society and a lot of social divisions, give me a pardon so that I can heal those divisions. Or in other words, I'm extorting you, and if you don't give me a pardon, I will destroy Israeli society. This is really what we're seeing here. It's like organized crime asking for protection money, saying, "Oh, you are very vulnerable. Something bad could happen to you. So if you give us money, we will protect you." And in this way, Netanyahu is extorting the president and extorting the Israeli public, really. But let's not forget, the Israeli public wants to be extorted. They want very much to have this excuse to say, well, we had this dictator, this populist leader, Netanyahu, and he has taken us all hostages, and that's the reason that we have committed genocide.
Yeah, of course, after the break, that'll be the question I will be asking you, Shir, with regards to protests that is happening across Israel. Is it really genuine, or is it a worry for Israeli citizens in terms of the leadership that they have? My conversation with Dr. Shir Hever continues after the break. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Dr. Shir Hever, who's an independent researcher. Shir, we've seen protests happening, some of them happening outside Isaac Herzog's house, some of them happening outside Benjamin Netanyahu's house. My question to you is, just like the protests that we see in Israel with regards to the calling for the release of the hostages, how genuine is it in terms of really wanting to hold its leadership accountable in a time where impunity for Israel is at its highest? Or is there really a concern from their side that its actual society is going to fall, and hence it being declared a failed state?
Well, the protests are very exaggerated. I think that maybe you're seeing reports by Israeli media, which is trying to promote this kind of liberal image as if the Israeli public is actually very committed to supporting democracy in Israel. But on the ground, it's not a lot of people at all that are protesting. In fact, there were much bigger protests which were against the war. And these protesters claim to be calling for an end of the war in Gaza and the release of the hostages. But they really only meant the Israeli hostages that were held in Gaza. And once there was a ceasefire, which is not a very real ceasefire, because Israel continues to attack in Gaza, but the hostages have been overall released, then suddenly the protests have stopped. So I think this shows that they're not really protesting to end the war. They're only protesting for one side. And those protests were also used by Netanyahu himself and his government to try to create the image as if there is a plurality of opinions in Israel, as if there is a vibrant democracy with a protest movement. But now we see it's simply not true. There is no real protest movement. I think that you use the term failed state. I'm not sure this is the correct term. I think we are talking about an apartheid state, and we're talking about a failing colonial project in a state in a crisis moment of decolonization. And of course, a lot of Israelis are leaving and are despairing because they see no future for this colonial project anymore. And I think that Netanyahu is trying, with every bit of power that he has and every trick that he has up his sleeve, to maintain the illusion everything will be fine, everything will return to normal, as if the world will forget this whole genocide. And I think that when it relates to the issue of the legal process against Netanyahu, there was a caricature in one of Israel's newspapers where they said, Netanyahu's wife was telling him, look, you're going to get a pardon, so now we can travel around the world again. And the joke is, of course, that no, they cannot travel around the world because there is an arrest warrant against Netanyahu from the International Criminal Court. And Netanyahu can go only to countries that are not signatories to the International Criminal Court, like the United States, but most of the world is actually closed to him. And it doesn't matter if the president gives him a pardon about these corruption charges, tiny crimes in comparison to the crime of genocide, which it will not convince the International Criminal Court to lift the arrest warrant. In fact, it will only do the opposite. It will convince the International Criminal Court, as well as the International Court of Justice, that Israel does not have an independent judicial system, and in fact, Israel is not does not have a separation of powers, and the prime minister is not subject to the law, which means that international jurisdiction has to take place.
Yeah, and that's where I wanted to come with the next question, Shir, because he's got this ICC arrest warrant hanging over his head, and I guess he's kind of forgotten about it, which comes as no surprise, because of the non-remorseful nature that we see of Netanyahu. And there's still the ICJ case, which of course was brought by South Africa with regards to Israel's genocide in Gaza. And I guess the question is, is this going to be, if this pardon is granted to him by Isaac Herzog, going to be a deterrent against him? Because you've mentioned something quite important. It then puts the question in terms of the judiciary within Israel, which in the Israeli constitution, Netanyahu has been trying to change. So how much does this pardon probably going to work against him should it be granted?
I think that for international jurisdiction, for international courts, the question of the corruption cases against Netanyahu play no role, really. They care about the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the crime of apartheid, and the crime of genocide. This is what international courts are dealing with, and whether he received gifts and bribes and promoted one newspaper over another, abusing his power. These are corruption cases that I don't think the ICC or the ICJ are interested in and will not intervene in. But I don't agree that Netanyahu forgot about the arrest warrant at all, because as soon as the ceasefire imposed by Trump came into power on October 10th, Israel immediately fired a request at the ICC to cancel the cases against Netanyahu and against Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, by saying, well, the war is over, so you can remove the cases, which legally speaking is completely absurd. You cannot murder somebody and say, well, I've stopped murdering them, so now please, there's no more need for accountability. And also, it is very interesting to see that the channel by which Israel filed this request to end the proceedings was not through the official Israeli Ministry of Justice, as it should be, but rather through the representative of Israel at the ICC. Israel has not signed the Rome Convention of the ICC, and nevertheless, it has a representative, and this representative is a very minor official. And the reason that they sent it through this minor official is because the actual esteemed lawyers that work for the Israeli government, those who are trained and have some kind of status, didn't want to dirty their hands with it. They said this is a request that has nothing to do with the law. We cannot file it, and it's not a reasonable excuse to say that the war is over, and therefore we refuse to do it. So Netanyahu is still absolutely concerned about international jurisdiction, and I think that this also explains why he's trying to work so closely with Trump, because the US government has traditionally been the ally of Israel and other criminal states in their attempts to eliminate the whole idea of international jurisdiction and to attack the international courts.
Shir, one of the arguments that he's made is that if he does get this pardon, he will be able to strengthen Israel at what he says is a tumultuous time for the Middle East. Now, I look at the way Israel has conducted itself pre and post October the 7th, and it's a worry. They've attacked Iran, they've attacked Syria, even when Bashar al-Assad was overthrown. We see what they've done in Lebanon, even when there's a ceasefire that was being agreed upon between Hezbollah and Israel. We see what's happening in Gaza. As we speak right now, the violations are still happening, and we see what is happening in the occupied West Bank. On top of that, they attacked a sovereign country in Qatar when they was trying to say there were their attempts at eliminating the Hamas negotiating team. And I just think to myself that if this pardon does happen, it's not going to stop Benjamin Netanyahu going ahead and really wanting to carry out what they are saying within the Israeli cabinet, this greater Israel project.
You forgot to mention that Israel also attacked Tunisia and also attacked Lebanon, two sovereign states as well. So absolutely, Israel completely ignores international law and international agreements and acts with complete impunity. I don't think that the pardon will stop it. Of course, quite the opposite. Netanyahu believes that if he receives a pardon, then he will be prime minister forever. And I think that this is his plan. But I think we should not be naive. We should understand that from the point of view of Netanyahu's strategy, if he doesn't receive the pardon, this is also something that works in his favor. Then he would say, oh, the president is not impartial, and actually the president is part of the conspiracy against me. This gives him legitimacy then to go after the president, to go after any oppositional force in Israel, though the protesters, the few protesters who are demanding accountability inside Israel according to the Israeli anti-corruption laws will also, of course, be targeted and are already being targeted. Their faces are being photographed by the police. The government has actually just now authorized new procedures allowing the police to use their personal phones to take pictures of protesters and to collect information on protesters. And because they're using their personal phones, there is no accountability against the police, right? So this would be admissible then if they want to punish those protesters, but it will not be admissible if the protesters are trying to get accountability from the police. So Netanyahu is using every trick that he has in order to gain more power. But we should not see this as just a crisis of rule of law inside Israel. The crisis is that the masks are off, that Israel has always pretended to be a democracy in the Middle East with equal rights to its citizens, and expected the world to ignore the fact that it's an occupying force, an apartheid state, that only Jews have privileges and full rights in this state. And now it's so obvious, so Netanyahu needs to change the strategy and to use more intimidation and more brute force. Hence also these out-of-control attacks on Syria, Lebanon, Qatar, Iran, Tunisia, and so on, and Yemen.
Dr. Shir Hever, always good to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
That's Dr. Shir Hever, independent researcher, joining us to have this discussion. Well, that's all we have for you here on the News in Focus. I will see you again on Saturday for a talking point from myself, for Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. If you've missed today's episode, it will be on our YouTube channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.